And we are live for this week's episode of Samanthropolitics. I'm your host, Samantha Carlin, and I'm delighted to be with you here tonight to discuss a very important issue, which is the liberation of Syria from 50 years of rule by the Assad family. Back in the wings, I have an amazing woman who was an undercover journalist in Syria throughout the war, Rasha Elass, who's now the editorial director of New Lines magazine. But first, as usual, let's give a little bit of history. I also just want to give a brief notice that we have some exclusive footage that will be airing during this episode. But the show does contain violent images and themes that may be disturbing or triggering to some viewers, including blood, war, and children. Viewer discretion is advised, and please ensure that you're in appropriate setting to watch and take care of your emotional well-being. Viewership by children is not recommended. I also want to give some credit to the photographers who took the photos you're about to see in these montages. Our guest, Rasha Elass, an alumni of the Women's Leadership Challenge and founder of Versus, Sophie Tarnoska, who was in Syria right before the revolution started, and Malik Tarbush, Syrian photojournalist and founder of Hadith Media Center. Before we dive in, I just want to give a quick word from our sponsors. Walker Advertising is one of our sponsors. Walker Advertising provides law firms with leads and resources. They have a national network of over 350 law firms, and they've connected millions of consumers seeking legal help with fabulous attorneys. And Empower Global, which, as you know, is my company, which is a cutting-edge leadership development company. We do leadership training, accelerators, and executive coaching all over the world in different languages. And we have a proprietary online course on cross-cultural teamwork and GPT, helping people to work more effectively across borders. We also host the Women's Leadership Challenge, a groundbreaking program for women to step into their power, navigate transitions, create change, and become thought leaders. So just a brief word about this show. This is a very special show for me to report on Syria. When I was in graduate school at the Fletcher School, it was the height of the Syrian war, and I kept seeing footage of Assad and the Russians that were helping him barrel bombing civilians and a massive civilian casualties. And in Judaism, you grew up constantly being taught about the Holocaust, and the mantra is never again, never again, never again. And I felt this intense guilt of knowing that these barrel bombs were being dropped on mostly 95% innocent civilians, and there seemed to be no repercussions from the rest of the world. I also took this class in graduate school called Sovereignty and Intervention, and we talked about R2P, which is the responsibility to protect, which essentially means that we have an obligation as an international community to go in and help when there's dictators killing his own people. But it's logistically extremely complicated because of sovereignty. Furthermore, I was horrified when Obama set a red line and said, if Assad uses chemical weapons against his people, we're going to do something. And then we did pretty much nothing. I was horrified by my own government. So for my master's thesis, I initially was going to do a docu-series on Syria, trying to split up the Syrian conflict into small, digestible pieces. When I was looking for footage of the war to put into this documentary series, I happened upon Hadith Media Center. Now, Hadith was founded at the height of the Civil War by Malik Tarbush to promote footage of the war to international journalists so that they would be able to expose the war crimes of the regime and what was happening there. Unsurprisingly, it was no longer in existence by the time that I looked it up because it had been bombed because it was obviously threatening the regime. But I did find its founder, Malik, on Facebook, and I messaged him. I didn't know whether he was dead or alive at this time. To my surprise, he responded to me and actually provided us with some of the footage that you're about to see in this short little documentary piece before we get into our episode. Ultimately, as my Uncle Bob would say, RIP Uncle Bob, to make a long story beautiful or unbearable, either one, I ended up becoming an editor of the book Aleppo, A Revolution, which was Malik Tarbush's photojournalism from the war, paired with stories to go with them of what was happening. Malik is an amazing guy. The first story in the book is about how he was arrested by the regime. He was tortured and left for dead. They had to drink water out of the toilets to survive. They tried to get him to sign papers saying that he was a terrorist so that he could get out. He refused. He said, a camera is not a gun. I'm not a terrorist. He luckily was able to get out without signing that paper. But that label of terrorism is really important because governments do it frequently to delegitimize people and to make them seem as if they're not actors that we can be in conversation with. And that has to do with what's happening with HTS today. He went on to film the protests, and Malik then was in a barrel bomb attack by the Russians where both legs were shattered. I'm super excited to tell you that Malik is still alive today, and he has two beautiful children. And if you saw the image of the show, those are his kids that are in the image of the show, waving the flag in celebration at the liberation of Syria. So what you're about to see is our never before viewed first little documentary piece on Syria, which originally was going to be aired by Syria Deeply. It was edited by Billbox Niedlinger, and it also features Basma Alouche, who was my Fletcher classmate and also is Syrian. I also just want to give a brief aside that the statistics in the video are not accurate anymore. These were the numbers. This was produced and filmed in 2016. So on that note, Meg, if you could roll that video.
In general, the Assad regime has tried to target areas that it feels have betrayed it.
What's really troubling about the Syrian war is that it's been characterized predominantly by the targeting of civilians. Now, even though the US focuses mostly on ISIS, in actuality, the Syrian government forces have caused 95% of the civilian casualties.
Aleppo is a commercial hub. Aleppo was the last city to join the uprisings and the revolution in 2011, and they were very, very scared because they knew the retaliation of the regime and they were terrified that it would happen there. So there was a lot of uprisings, and unfortunately it was infiltrated by a lot of different groups. Some were actually rebel groups that were fighting for the opposition. It became also infiltrated with other groups. Now the regime claims that al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, is hubbed in Aleppo, but I mean, there's very little evidence to support that theory, and the regime in Russia have been using that as an excuse to bomb Aleppo. And if you really look at the areas they've been bombing, it's mostly civilians. It's indiscriminate. There's recently been a video that was released by a pilot that was showing off how they were lighting the barrel bombs in the helicopters, and he was kind of taking a selfie while he smokes a cigarette, and then he'll use like the back camera to show the other soldiers and how they were lighting the barrel bomb, and then he actually took the video to show you how the barrel bombs were being dropped. And if you look at it, there's no coordination. They don't know where it's falling, you know? It's all homes, it's little, vegetable shops of people, it's the market. That's where their livelihoods are, and they've just been targeting that indiscriminately without any warning, including, hospitals that were affiliated with MSF, and, all the losses are tragic. It's heartbreaking because this is when the people need it the most.
All of the latter amount to severe abrogations of international humanitarian law. They're war crimes and crimes against humanity, and they should be treated as such. Instead of giving Syrians the protection that they so want and the basic safety that they need, instead we're using humanitarian aid as a fig leaf, giving food baskets where Syrians really want protection from barrel bombs. Maybe this is to palliate our own conscience, but it's not actually meeting what the needs are on the ground and addressing the root causes of why Syrians are starving to death, because there's a war. In reality, the biggest danger that they face is death by bombs. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Daria.
General,
All right, so hopefully that gives a little bit of perspective of what was happening in 2016, which was 8 years ago, and just also how long this war has been going on. And it almost can't be characterized as a war because so much of it was really Assad attacking his own people. So you can play that, or you can put that map up, Meg. Thank you to our producer, Matt. Meg, excuse me. So if we look at Syria, what happened is that if you look at the top, there's something called Idlib province, and the rebels, they have been governing Idlib province for quite a while, and they went down through the country. So they swept over to Aleppo, then they went down to Homs, and then they came down and they finally liberated Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. Meg, you can play that Sophie slideshow, please. Thank you to Sophie Tarnowska for taking these pictures. But let's go back for a minute to the history of Syria and try to get some context and figure out where we are now. So important to know that Syria is one of the oldest inhabited areas of the world. Earliest known human remains are actually 700,000 years old. There have been all sorts of empires that have existed there: Egyptians, Sumerians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, on and on and on and on and on, that they occupied and dominated Syria in antiquity. The Bible has also made reference to ancient Syria. In one story, the Apostle Paul said he had visions that led to his conversion to Christianity on the road to Damascus. Interesting. Syria joined the Byzantine Empire after the fall of the Roman Empire. Then the Muslim forces overthrew the Byzantine Empire, taking Syria in 637 AD. And about 750 AD, Baghdad took the place of Damascus as the capital of the Islamic world. Then the Ottoman Empire took control of Syria in 1516 and ruled until 1918. Then there was World War I, something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is quite important. This is where the French and the British decided to carve up the Ottoman Empire into different zones. And they were split, the majority of Arab territories were split into British and French spheres of influence. Damascus and Aleppo were taken by the Arab and British forces. And in 1920, the French took what is now Syria and Lebanon. So 400 years of Ottoman rule in the area came to an end as a result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Syria and France, in an independence treaty in 1936, gave Syria independence and granted France economic and military might. Then Syria was controlled by British and Free French forces during World War II, but then gained its independence ultimately after the conflict in 1946, after World War II. Then, after Syria proclaimed independence, there was all sorts of instability and coup. The United Arab Republic was formed in 1958 when Syria and Egypt joined, but then it disbanded in 1961. Then there were military takeovers, uprising, riots in the 60s. In the Ba'ath Revolution, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party took control of Syria in 1963, and Israel took control of the Golan Heights, which is a mountainous plateau in southwest Syria during the Six-Day War in 1967. This is actually pretty important and relevant to what's going on now. I don't know if you've been to the Golan Heights before, but literally during the Syrian war, you could hear the shooting and the bombs that were happening in Syria from the northern part of Israel, which is the Golan Heights. This is pretty important because basically what's happened since Assad has fled and since it's been liberated is that Israel has done an incursion into past the Golan Heights and taken over a portion of Syria, including the Syrian side of what's called Mount Hermon, which is a strategically important peak that Israel has taken over. Israel has also been mounting airstrikes into Syria to try to destroy chemical weapons factories, the Navy, air bases, ammunition, and other military hardware. According to the observatory, they've struck Syria more than 450 times. We'll talk to our guest about the significance of that and what exactly is going on there. In 1970, Salah Jadid was overthrown by Hafez al-Assad. You could know this name, Assad. Then he served as president for 30 years before that. In 1973, Israel was at war with Egypt and Syria. And then the Muslim Brotherhood staged an uprising against the Assad government in Hama in 1982. And that's when Assad put political insurgents under arrest, tortured them, and killed them. So it's important to know that this Assad family has been in power. It's not like the US where we have somebody in power for 4 years or maybe 8 years. It's as if Trump and all of his family members had been in control for the last 50 years, or Biden and every single family member had been in control. It's like, it's the only thing that Syria kind of knows. And what you see in Sophie's slideshow right before the revolution is that his face is everywhere. His face is on watches, his face is on walls, his face is on the highway. His face is ever present. And I remember the first time I heard Basma speak about the war, and she said, we were terrified because even the waiter that was standing there at dinner could be reporting into Assad. Everybody was in like the secret Assad police infrastructure, and nowhere was safe to speak your mind because you would be put in prison and tortured. So the Assad family has been an institution of repression and oppression and torture for 50 years. Bashar al-Assad, who's the one who's now fled to Russia, where he's claimed political asylum, with his buddy Putin. He succeeded his father at 34 in 2000. He was actually initially not selected as the successor because he was a medical student. His older brother Bassel was supposed to, but he was killed in a car accident in 1994. So then Bashar al-Assad took over. All right, let's go to 2002. Syria is designated as one of the countries in the so-called axis of evil, if we can remember that. The country was accused of obtaining WMDs. The U.S. reimposed sanctions on Syria in 2010. Meg, you can roll the footage of the war, the war slideshow. So like I was saying, Assad was famous, both Assads, for assassinating, torturing, imprisoning political opponents, trying to say that they're terrorists, which is taken from the United States and our war, and saying that everyone was a terrorist and therefore we legitimately could detain them without due process and do enhanced interrogations and all the other fun stuff we did in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. So in 2011, there's uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia. Tunisia was the first one. This became known as the Arab Spring. Syria came after that. There were some teenagers that were detained and tortured in 2011. The Syrians said, okay, we're done with this. And so they started demonstrating in a nonviolent way against the Syrian regime. Well, Assad came after them. That's when the barrel bombs start, and that's when the war really got bad. So civilian resistance has been throughout this war, but has been in pockets. So like there was the Free Syrian Army that was established in 2011. By 2012, they were in a full-fledged civil war. Then Syria decided to use chemical weapons, as I was saying before, in 2013, and I was pissed at Obama. And everyone watching this knows that I love Obama and can't stand Trump, but I have to say in this particular case, I was very disappointed that Obama did nothing. And Trump actually, to his credit, mounted the first strikes against Syria in 2017. So he actually did take action, which, to be honest, surprised me. ISIS has also been involved in this. They've controlled portions of Syria and Iraq since 2014. And let's see. And then, generally speaking, the impact of this is about, as of 2020, over half the population was forced from their homes. I also want to just give a brief point to as we talk about this, all we talk about is, military heroes, etc. But Syrian women have been quite important too in mounting this revolution. There was something called the Syrian Women's Advisory Board that was established by the Office of the Special Envoy in January 2016. And Meg, you can run that slideshow of those Syrian women activists. This was in partnership with UN Women, and because there had been all these peace talks that Syrian women had systematically been excluded from, which is ridiculous because women are the keys to civil society and to actual peace building. Usually men are just the ones involved because they're the ones with the weapons, but they don't actually know how to build peace. So they were able to do a couple things. They advocated for gendered language in various documents related to political process. 9 Syrian women have given high-level briefings to the Security Council. And before 2019, no Syrian women representing civil society had ever briefed the Security Council. Okay, and now we're at today. So, we're going to talk a little bit about with Russia, but essentially with Russia embroiled in Russia and Iran have been key to this. And with Russia embroiled in Ukraine and with Iran embroiled Hezbollah and Lebanon and against Israel, all of a sudden these two major supports of Assad's regime have dissipated, and poverty, I think, a normal professor is making $40 a month in Syria, but groceries are still really expensive. Russia can talk about. People were disenchanted, the military was disenchanted, and economic and humanitarian crisis. Also, there's a really interesting article about drug production and addiction to drugs in Syria. Basically, just have eroded the state structures. So enter this group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is designated as a terrorist organization by the US and other countries, led by a guy named Abu Mohammad al-Jolani. You can put that picture up of Abu Mohammad al-Jolani, Meg. They, like I said, they came down from Idlib because they were controlling Idlib province, and then they went through Aleppo, down to Homs, and down to Damascus. And all of a sudden, this 50-year regime is over, which is just, I was just stunned. And it's so exciting, and like just so meaningful for so many Syrians that have lived under oppression or they left. It also, as you'll remember, Syria, there was a major refugee crisis that majorly affected Europe, with millions having to flee the country. So what's going on right now? Bashar al-Assad is gone. Goodbye. Thank you. Goodbye. As my grandmother would say, thank you, goodbye, and good luck. He is now in Russia, granted asylum by Putin. And you can, let's actually roll that image, those videos, Meg, of the some of the liberation scenes that are happening in Syria today, or have happened in the last few days. That's fine. So Mohammed al-Bashir, who was the head of the regional government in HTS's enclave of Idlib province, like I mentioned, has been appointed Syria's new interim prime minister, and we're not sure what happens next. And that's why I'm super excited to bring on my guest, resident badass and editorial director of New Lines magazine, Rasha Elass. When I looked at her bio, I was just blown away, especially after seeing the film about the woman who was reporting in Syria, the British journalist who died in Syria and was never heard from again. This was extremely dangerous to report in Syria, especially for foreign journalists. They were not safe at all, and they were not protected by international humanitarian law like you normally would be. So Rasha covered the Middle East for more than 10 years. She was born in Syria. She grew up in Algiers and Lebanon, and she was an undercover journalist in Syria, freelancing for Reuters, the LA Times, NPR, The World, International Business Times, most of the time not even having a byline for security reasons because the regime would have come after her. She holds a Master of Science from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and a Master of Science in Finance from American. She also writes for the Middle East Institute, Reuters Opinion, and Public Radio International. She also launched the Voices Unheard podcast, and like I said, is now the editorial director of New Lines magazine. So let's bring Rasha in. Rasha, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So love to, just give the audience a little bit of understanding of, your experience as a undercover war correspondent and while this war is going on. If you could give us some insights.
Yeah. So just to give you an idea of what it's like, or what it was like, it's nice to say was actually, what it was like to cover Syria under Assad. In times of peace, before the war started, normally what would happen for any member of the international media, you would apply for a visa if you're not a Syrian citizen. I mean, I could go in without a visa, but I still had, like any other journalist, I had to sort of declare myself to the Ministry of Information, as they called it, to register myself as a journalist, which I actually only did that very briefly in 2005/2006 when I was there officially with Reuters. So during the war, I could not do that. I couldn't register myself with the information ministry because they were not allowing members of the international media to come into the country and cover the war, or they were allowing only specific ones that they gave a visa, that they brought in with permission, and that they kept a very close eye on, and only allowed to go to certain places. So what I ended up doing was, and I felt compelled to do that because I was very often the only member of international media who could actually access both regime-controlled areas and rebel-controlled areas. So I would go, stay in Damascus proper, which was under regime control, and then I would sneak into rebel-controlled areas around Damascus in the suburbs, which were under siege at the time. And I would also sneak sometimes into, other parts of Syria that were under rebel control, and then come back to regime-controlled Damascus. And so I would be able to see the difference.
What was the
yeah, I mean, that was basically.
What was the difference? When you're looking at regime versus rebel-controlled areas.
The rebel-controlled areas were under siege at that time. So, for example, one time I remember sneaking into an area called Ghouta. And Ghouta is famous, or unfortunately infamous, because that's where a chemical attack happened. That's where Assad used the Syrian gas attack in 2013. So, and that area was already under siege. So people were not allowed to bring in baby milk. They were not allowed to bring medication or bread or anything like that. And even the movement of people was very, very restricted. So I went in with the smuggler, and we were clearing the final checkpoint into the besieged area. And of course, they were searching our car very thoroughly. And, I wanted to bring at least some food because I knew the people inside Ghouta would be so hungry and at the same time so insistent to share their food with me. So I didn't want to be their burden. I wanted to at least bring food that I could eat, so I didn't have to share their food with them. I couldn't bring in dates. I couldn't bring in bread. I mean, you just couldn't bring in anything. And in the end, I spent 3 days with people who were besieged, and they shared their food with me. They had a few olives to eat, and they insisted that I eat a couple of olives with them.
They're very hospitable,
and I mean,
Syrians.
Yes, they are. Of course, there was no way they weren't going to share their food with me. And it was that part was almost as difficult as being there and covering everything else. Yeah.
Are there any specific memories that you think are important to point out, particularly in the context of what's going on now?
There's so many. I mean, I was born in Damascus, and then I've spent my entire life going back periodically. And sometimes there were times when I lived there 1 or 2 years at a time. And of course I was born, I don't know anything other than the Assad regime. I was born after he came into power. So after the father came into power, I was born before the year 2000. Yeah. It's really hard to explain just walking around the streets of Damascus and just being tense. You're being observed. One time, for example, I couldn't I couldn't lift, or I tried to lift my phone and take a photo of just a statue in a park, in a public park. And this was in peacetime. This was before the war. And I didn't think much of it at the time. And before I knew it, I was flanked by state security who started questioning me. Why was I snapping a photo of a random piece of art in a public park? I mean, this was Syria in peacetime under Assad.
There's constant suspicion, constant
yeah,
observation, constant like you know, what are you doing?
Absolutely. And so you're always on pins and needles. And this, people internalize it. People, even in their own living rooms, in the privacy of their home, they just don't go there. They don't talk about anything that they feel that they've internalized might get them into trouble with the regime, with the secret police and the authorities. And so it's just, it's just utter oppression and suppression of thoughts and feelings and emotions about how you feel about your own country.
Yeah. And what gave you, I mean, as I was reading your stuff, and I was reading Clarissa Ward's book yesterday about her getting shot at as she's running it, like, this was not safe, right? Like, what gave you the courage to do this, to report from there? I mean, it's, how did you have that chutzpah, as my grandmother would say?
The chutzpah, yeah. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I don't know about courage. Sometimes you just feel compelled, sometimes maybe it's foolhardy even. It's just hard not to do it, especially that I really was the only member of international media that I knew and that who could do both, who could go into regime-controlled areas and rebel-controlled areas. Hardly anyone could access regime-controlled areas to begin with, and many could access rebel-controlled areas from the north through Turkey. But, hardly anyone could do both from Damascus and the areas
why
around
were
Damascus.
You able to access both? What was it about you? Because you were
because I could use my Syrian ID card, just to kind of walk around. So I wasn't a foreigner, right? So
right.
So I was just a local going around, and sometimes I would, in order to sneak into regime. I have to take a moment because it's very strange that I'm even talking about this publicly, because I would not have been able to discuss any of this just a week or 10 days ago.
Wild.
It is truly wild. So, but anyway, so I would basically, in order to get into the rebel controlled areas, and maintain my cover as just an ordinary random citizen, I would have to have a story, because I'd have to answer questions as to why I was going into that area, questions at checkpoints, regime checkpoints. And they wanted to make sure that no activists were getting in, no journalists were getting in, that no one was getting in, unless, they're basically living inside the besieged area. So I would come up with stories like, oh, I'm here to visit my sister who's married to so-and-so. And they would ask me questions. What's your sister's name? Who's she married to? Where do they live? And I would have to have all those answers prepared, and I would have to deliver them with a straight face.
Wow.
And this is not what they train you to do in journalism school. I mean, it's not my job, but it was the only way to get in.
Especially especially as like kind of a spy,
Oh, as far as they're concerned, and actually toward the end, when I felt that my cover was being blown, it was, and then I couldn't really go back for some time, for like a few years after toward the end of the war, and that's because they flagged my name, and my name was basically wanted for questioning. Wow. And I was definitely suspected of that. So,
were you ever scared?
I was scared a lot. scared a lot. I was constantly sort of prepared to execute a plan. It wasn't just having my sort of ready, like a bag ready by the door, but I had, for example, I had my 2 cats with me, and they were sort of near and dear. And I know it's strange to talk about cats in the middle of a war, but it just felt like, with all the atrocities that were going on around me, it would have felt like the hair that would have broken the camel's back had something happened to one of the cats in the war. It just would have that just would have pushed me into, just a real heartbreak. So I would practice
through checkpoints with your cats.
Well,
I love
there
this.
were times when I had to do that. There were absolutely
Amazing.
times when I had to do that. Absolutely. But I would literally practice putting the cats each in their carrier and like carrying them down in case there were mortar attacks on my neighborhood, which there were several times. My neighborhood was in regime controlled Damascus, and sometimes the rebels would send mortars. They weren't too far. The rebels were just in the suburbs, so we would come under a mortar attack. And I mean, just hearing the sort of whistle of a mortar or missile going over the building, and I mean, I can't count the times when I was, very afraid. But the fear was sort of constant and always in the background. Absolutely.
It's amazing. I mean, as somebody who teaches a feminist leadership course, right, I'm always teaching courage to my students, and, what does that mean? And then just seeing women like you, it's such a model of courage for other women and people to just see someone who, this getting the word out about what's happening is just that important, right? That you're willing to risk your life. It's amazing.
Yeah, but thank you. That's very generous of you. But when I was there, I would always think, this is really scary. But I bet the 5-year-old girl who was killed today was even more scared.
Oh.
It's just like, it just didn't matter that I was scared because of the context that I was in.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, when I was editing the Aleppo book, it was like just some of the, I had to take breaks between editing the book. I mean, I wasn't even there, right? From, writing a story about a children's school that was doing show and tell. And the next thing you know, they're all dead by a barrel bomb. I mean, it's just horrific. And you're seeing the pictures of kids' feet sticking out of the rubble. I mean, really, it's just inhumane, and it is. It's disgusting. Like it's atrocities. And I hope that actually I wasn't going to go here first, but do you think the ICC is going to really do a thorough investigation and try to indict him for war crimes and crimes against humanity?
I think so. I mean, if I were to, guess, I would say so. It's interesting. I don't know if you saw it today, but he issued a public statement from Moscow. Assad did, and no one asked him to, but he just decided to issue a public statement. And I haven't read it closely, to be perfectly honest, but it's something like, I just want to clear the record. I didn't escape. I didn't flee. Because, everybody was saying, oh, he fled like a coward the night before and all that stuff. And he's like, I didn't flee. I stuck it out till the very end. And I was fighting side by side with my troops. And I left only that morning. God, and this and that. Yeah. And so to be honest, I was surprised to see that he did that. But now I'm thinking, okay, well, now Assad and Putin are just going to troll the international community and the Syrian people. And so it'll just be kind of interesting as we move forward. I'm pretty sure the ICC, there will be a very, very huge and easy to put together case against them. I mean, already the evidence just from the first 24 hours that the rebels took over. Yeah, absolutely. And the documentation and the prisoners, and it's on an industrial scale, and they keep finding mass graves. They keep, and I think, it's like, I have my hand on my heart, because it's just going to go on and on. It's truly industrial scale. It's just devastating, absolutely devastating.
So I want to ask you, well, actually, let's go here first. How did you feel when you heard that Assad had fled and that the rebels had taken over?
Yeah, so it was still Thanksgiving weekend. So I was kind of sort of looking forward to the weekend, and then I started hearing that they took over Aleppo, and wow, okay. But I was still in weekend mode, and I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. We'll see what happens next. I think Homs and Hama will be more difficult. And then boom, they take Hama, they take Homs, and it's like, oh my God. And then a lot of people were still saying, oh, but Damascus is different. It's still heavily fortified. That would be huge if they took Damascus. It's unfathomable. And of course, a lot of this is also psychological. I mean, it is unfathomable that after half a century, something goes just poof like that. So I was kind of in denial, just not really sure what to think of it, just kind of watching the news and trying to keep a distance. And then I have family and friends, lots of loved ones in Damascus, and I was in touch with them. And it's like, wow, the rebels, they just kept getting closer and closer to the city. And then finally, they're in the city, and they're in Umayyad Square. Umayyad Square is just down the street from my family's home.
Wow.
And that's Umayyad Square is iconic because that's where the state-run TV station is located, and it's also where there's an iconic library called Assad Library that overlooks it. And it's just like this huge square. It's the first square you see when you're coming into, it's very iconic. You see it when you first come into the city. So, I mean, I was in disbelief, to be perfectly honest.
Did you think that some of the stuff that they were saying about Damascus was true, that it was like more heavily fortified, it was more of like a regime enclave, that they weren't going to be able to take over?
Yes, I did. I did think it was, I just didn't envision Assad would just up and leave like that so easily. I was hoping very much that there wouldn't be clashes, that there wouldn't be bloodshed, that there wouldn't be any fighting. But I did not foresee it happening like that. And I was in Damascus just last month, and I actually have a knack of leaving just before a big story hits. It's just like I always do that somehow. So I was there up until like maybe 1 week or 10 days before the rebels took Aleppo, before the whole thing started. And when I was there, I thought, and everybody also, everyone that I talked to in Damascus was saying this, everybody felt there was something cooking in the background. They weren't sure what. But it was strange because, for example, the state security apparatus was much more relaxed than I'd ever seen it, which is strange because at the same time there were periodic Israeli airstrikes. At that time, they were targeting members of the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah and whatever. So it was like surgical strikes sometimes in the city, in and around the city. So in spite of that, usually when there are Israeli airstrikes or when something big is going on, that you feel the state security is on constant alert and they're very vigilant. You can't walk down the street without like eyes being on you all the time. But this time, it was just really surprising. They were so relaxed. They were more relaxed than I even could remember them from before the war in times of peace. So yeah, something was cooking. And of course, nobody could have thought this, but something was up, and so it's interesting. Yeah.
So what do you think, because the Assad security forces for so long were so loyal and were so, like you said, like vigilant. Why do you think this, I mean, we talked, I mentioned, Russia being elsewhere and Iran being elsewhere, but like, why do you think this happened now? Like how did they not protest? Or
how did they not fight? Exactly. I mean, they abandoned their posts, they put down their weapons, they walked away. I'll tell you, I mean, they were hungry. I mean, Syria's economy has shrunk by like 80-90% since 2011. Because of the war.
90%. That's wild.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely. And the local currency has, plummeted.
Inflation, I know, is like crazy high.
Inflation is crazy. There's a huge like wealth disparity. There's the post-war money sloshing around. So for basically the army and Assad's men and his thugs, known locally as Shabiha, all those, I mean, they're kind of hungry. They just, nobody wanted to fight anymore. And I think, I mean, we're going to learn, I guess, as time moves forward, more and more about what was going on behind the scenes. But it seems that the rebels did a really good job with outreach, because they just kept doing a lot of outreach on the ground to Assad's men, basically promising them safe passage to go home, asking them to just put down their weapons, telling them they didn't want bloodshed. And at the same time, there are reports coming out that a lot of Assad's men who were in key positions were actually told to put down their weapons and walk away. And that's kind of strange. They were told from, higher up. So, yeah, we're gonna, I'm sure we'll learn more about what was going on behind the scenes.
So when
but
you say hungry, you mean physically hungry? Like,
yeah, absolutely physically hungry. For many years now, a lot of Syrians don't eat meat or chicken because they can't afford it.
Wow.
And this is like chicken and meat, it's part of the diet, but for several years, it's now really a rarity. I mean, that's how bad things have been for them.
It's so interesting thinking, because my last show was on Venezuela, and then I've been kind of marinating about why Maduro didn't get the support that he used to get from poor people, and lost the election even though he's still in power. And I see so many parallels between, he used to bribe people with buying them televisions and giving them radios and food and, all the kind of poor people to vote for him. And then the government ran out of money and he couldn't do this, the carrots anymore. So then he reverted to the sticks, and I think people, there's this trust formula that says credibility, reliability, and intimacy are three things required to trust somebody. And when those things go down, you don't feel like you can rely on your leader anymore. You don't feel safe. You don't feel like they're credible. They don't feel like they're saying what they're actually following through and what they do. People start to lose, and they're very self-interested. People start to lose their loyalty and affinity, because if they've been ruled by fear the whole time, it's not real loyalty. It's just fear-based loyalty, which is not ultimately sustainable loyalty, I think.
Exactly. Fear or carrots.
Right. Exactly. So let's talk about HTS. So why is it labeled a terrorist group? Should that, designation be lifted? What's the deal there?
So, al-Jolani, who's basically the commander of that has led the rebels throughout all these victories from Aleppo to Damascus, and he's been governing the Idlib region for I guess almost 10 years now. So at some point he was he was part of al-Qaeda. Before that, he was part of ISIS. He kept sort of joining and breaking off, until he, like the last breakoff was breaking off with al-Qaeda, and he formed HTS, which actually, I think it had one name before it turned into HTS. But anyway, that's hence the terror designation. But let me remind people of one thing. When the rebellion happened in Syria, it's before ISIS, before al-Qaeda, before Jabhat al-Sham, Jolani's, prior designation. Literally no one helped them. So they were just ordinary Syrians, and then suddenly they're on the receiving ends of the regime's live bullets, and then live sort of aerial bombardment. Mm-hmm. And slowly, they started to arm themselves, and they barely had any support. And you remember President Obama at one point said, they're, basically said, they're just a bunch of lawyers and accountants and CPAs. I mean, he was not wrong in describing them as such. They were just ordinary people who found themselves, having to defend themselves, or give in to getting killed, or going into exile.
Right, I know.
Or submit.
Malik was a software engineer. And then someone was like, will you film the protest? He's like, I'm not a videographer. But he went, and then he was hooked, and he was like, oh my God, like, yes, obviously I'll do this. But yeah, it's just a kind of a ragtag group, which makes it even more compelling, because it's like the David and Goliath kind of tale of these, people from all walks of life that then form this fighting force.
Exactly. And so in the end, the only people, the only sort of organized force that was well-funded, that had the weapons, that had the power, and the ability to maneuver and sort of defend territory was terror groups, ISIS and al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. That's where the money was. That's where the weapons and the organization was. No one else stepped up to help the rebels. So the fact, if Jolani had not done that, he probably would not be alive today, to be honest. Now, that said, I don't know what exactly he's done during his time of affiliation with these groups. And all that will come out, and all that will go under consideration. But it is important to keep in mind that this is not about him. He just happens to be, the successful commander who led this latest and iconic. And of course, he's going to go down in history.
Right.
Absolutely. In Syria's history, for sure. But this is not about him. So now, Syria can't be designated as a terror country. That is just ridiculous. This is a country that's coming out of trauma, that's trying to, recover from just absolute atrocities. Even HTS, Jolani is not HTS, and HTS is not Jolani. Jolani is one man.
Right.
So all that has to be addressed and assessed. And I hope that the powers that be have, the long vision and understand that this is a pivotal time for Syria. And if it's just dismissed as a terror country, that's not going to serve anybody.
So what can the international community do, not to interfere in the process, but to also help the country rebuild in this critical time?
Well, I see this process as, requiring sort of an incubator. Just think of Silicon Valley or any sort of incubator of ideas.
Oh, interesting.
It needs a lot of a lot of nurturing in terms of funding, expertise, people to come in and just help archive the evidence, for example, that will mount against Assad. It needs a mechanism for, to help all the Syrians to basically go through the process of transitional justice, which has been done several times before around the globe, with help from the United Nations, from the international community. Syrians are going to have to sit down also and draft a constitution, and there are many best practices already known about, how to best address that. So that's what's needed. And I'll tell you what's not needed. What's not needed is the sort of constant goading, like constant, oh, well, look, it's an Islamist, it's going to be an Islamist regime. It's, look what happened here. This constant like
it's going to be this repressive Afghanistan.
Yeah. Everybody's sort of waiting for that to happen. I mean, give it a chance. Give it.
Right. And if you look at the posture, even of Jolani and the group, and the fact, like, I think you're right. It's like Malik, for example, was not part of HTS, but he was like it was all of these groups over time, like the Free Syrian Army, even like the White Helmets and women's groups, like that all have like fomented this push towards ending this. It's not just HTS. So I think it's important to understand it's not like in Afghanistan where like the Taliban is kind of this centralized unit with very strict Sharia law and very strict rules about what women can and can't do, and doesn't have these like kind of pockets of differences like what we're seeing in Syria, which almost seems like a patchwork of different rebel groups that then HTS were the final ones that led the final push, but they've all contributed to it for years and years, right?
Exactly. And, it needs this sort of incubator protection so that Syrians can hear themselves think and hear each other speak. I mean, for half a century, if it hasn't been the political oppression that's been brutal, it's been the war that's been equally brutal, and the exile and the polarization and the heartbreak and the inability to have a conversation about it because everybody's so devastated. So, but that said, I will say that for several years now, probably throughout the war and even from before, but certainly throughout the war, civil society has been talking to each other, even civil society from within the regime controlled areas and those in exile and those in Idlib and all that. There have been a lot of conversations, informal, some formal. So, I mean, I'm hopeful, to be honest. There's a lot of the right ingredients are there. It just needs to, it's kind of like a souffle. You have to just kind of let it rise, let it do its thing. You can't just come crashing in.
Like, just thinking about like people that have been repressed for so long, and like just thinking about being able to have that like laboratory where people are finally able to raise their voices and exercise like what their visions for Syrian society should look like. And I mean, there's something like really beautiful about it, and like, you're right. Like, I think this is the worst time for America to come and be like, this is how you should do this. Like, we should, exist as facilitators or dialogue or whatever, but not to come in and say this is the way to do things while providing our expertise on like constitution drafting or whatever that is. So yeah, I think there's something really beautiful. I have a couple women from my women's leadership course that graduated, and one of them started something called New Visions, which is kind of like this incubator approach to long-term peace building. And they were focused on like Tunisia and other areas, but it's this idea of like getting multi-stakeholders together from all different parts of society and putting them together in this collaborative process to do like long-term visioning, hence New Visions, and then actually keeping them accountable for those long-term goals to build peace in a formerly authoritarian society. So that's the kind of process, I think, shout out to Nicole Roselle. Like, I think that would be so cool here.
Exactly.
But to not be oppressive. So, and then I'm also thinking, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to, I want to add one thing, and not just not to be oppressive, but not to be patronizing or sort of, pushing alienating language that really is best kept for Orientalists or sort of, a colonial era language. Like, for example, the language that's often pushed is the Constitution must protect women and minorities. That's really, it's very Orientalist, because sort of in the Syrian psyche, they don't think of Christians as minorities. That's a new colonial term. Christians are Syrians who are Christian. So instead of protecting all minorities, how about all Syrians are equal before the law, regardless of religion, sect, orientation, gender, class, whatever. So like simple language like that, things that just sound so Western and can be hijacked by just kind of hijacked by narrative.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece of that that's interesting is that that type of language posits women as victims, and minorities as victims. And I think that the reason I started a women's leadership course was because I'll never forget hearing from this UN special envoy for sexual violence to the UN. And she said, within the UN system, women are still constantly portrayed as victims. And yes, like we are, victims of sexual violence more so than men, and victims of domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera. However, what really needs to be done, I think, is to elevate women change makers and to fund them and to elevate women in conversation. It's not just about, like, I think that Americans are very much, they conflate the Arab world and they're like, oh, Afghanistan, where they're like putting women in hijabs, is going to be the same thing here. And it's just such a different country and context and history and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
So what I love that language. And I also think it's just like, how do we elevate women? And, in feminist foreign policy, they say rights, representation, and resources. How do we make sure that women have those things going forward and also have a really critical voice at the table as the new constitution is being carved, and it's not just male only kind of upper class exercise.
Exactly. Women have to be part of the conversation at every level, in every track, in every conversation about the economy, about society, about education, about religious freedom, all of it. Because hey, guess what? Women existed across all those, basically all those areas. So
right. And there's much more. I mean, it's not a peace process anymore, but the research around peace processes shows that if women are involved, the peace process is much more likely to actually be sustainable and last.
Always.
When they're involved in a peace process. So I want to take a brief break. I know we have some more questions. Hopefully you're still sticking around with us. I just want to take a brief break to go to our sponsors again. So I want to make a shout out to Walker Advertising. Walker Advertising provides law firms with leads and resources to reach new heights of success. They are a national network of over 350 law firms and have connected millions of consumers seeking legal help with attorneys. I also want to give a shout out to Stream Inspectors, Meg and Zach. You're amazing. They have been producing this show pro bono for 4 years, and I am so grateful to them, because without them, this show would not exist. And they are the leaders in live stream production. So please give them your business. If you want a professional looking show and don't want a crappy, poorly produced podcast that no one will listen to, look at Stream Inspectors, www.streaminspectors.com. Also, if you want to support us, you can support our show by going to www.patreon.com/Samanthropolitics1. That's SAMANTHRO Politics1. And there you can support us for as little as $3 a month if you do like this programming, because it takes an army to put it on. And lastly, As I mentioned before, Empower Global, we're a cutting-edge leadership development company that specializes in cross-cultural training, women's leadership, and putting together very bespoke types of accelerators that really meet the needs of your company based upon a sophisticated diagnostic process. We also run the Women's Leadership Challenge, and I am proud to teach the Women's Leadership Challenge, which now has 100 plus alums from 36 countries. And women are doing amazing things, from running for office to getting their books published to teaching national security courses at Duke. I could go on and on and on about the successes of my students. Meg, if you could just show that video, let's hear them talk instead of me.
I took the Women's Leadership Challenge in early 2021.
Samantha told me before I started that this could possibly change my life. And you know what? I think it might have done.
It gave me the very breakthrough I needed.
Fulfilled me in so many ways.
I found all my senses through this class.
So welcomed me just as I was.
I believe that we need more women leaders in the world. Women leaders who lead in innovative, creative, courageous ways that are true to who they are, that aren't a manufactured version of what a man would do at the top. So we're going to do things like finding your purpose, but we're also going to do things like looking at how do you create institutional change. Your cohort will become your sisters that will support you, elevate, lift you up.
I highly recommend that any woman who's looking for a pivot, looking for a boost, feeling imposter syndrome, definitely recommend the Women's Leadership Challenge.
It's really been a wonderful, life-changing, empowering experience, and I hope that you will join it as well.
So if you are interested in becoming an amazing women leader, you should already actually be a women leader, but I have 2 cohorts that are starting in February of 2025. They only have 8 spots each. One is held in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, in person every other week. And then the other one is held virtually online. So if you are a women leader who's looking to step up her game, become a change maker, become a thought leader, I encourage you to book a discovery call with me. Go to womensleadershipchallenge.com. and you can book a discovery call, and we can talk about your strengths and areas of growth as a leader in 2025, how to expand your impact, and discuss if the Women's Leadership Challenge is the right fit for you. And now back to our show on Syria. Okay, what is going on with Israel's airstrikes? Can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, well, so from Israel's perspective, I mean, basically they're hitting military, they're targeting with airstrikes military positions, basically for Assad's, military hardware, the port, the navy, the chemical plant, chemical weapons area. It's called the research area in Syria. And they've been targeting this for years, not with this, not to this extent, but they have periodically throughout the years, even before the war, every now and then they would just strike an area. Now, over the past week, since the fall of Assad, the airstrikes have been ferocious. I cannot explain to you. I mean, there's some footage. I think yesterday they struck an ammunition depot somewhere along the coast, and it was equivalent to an earthquake. I mean, wow. it was really, really just devastating. So I will say they have not been targeting civilian areas, and I'm not aware necessarily of, I'm not aware of civilian deaths to these strikes. I mean, these are areas that are abandoned military areas, but they are creating a lot of fear. They're devastating the environment. My loved ones in Damascus say the air quality is very difficult to breathe.
450 airstrikes in a week is like, How many of that is the day?
Yes.
2 weeks. How many a day is that? I can't even do the math. I mean, that's wild.
It's really crazy, and I have to wonder, what are they still striking? There's nothing left. I mean, this is Assad's army to begin with, wasn't very strong, wasn't so well equipped. What do they keep striking? They've been striking it for years, and this week they've been striking it ferociously. Now, while these airstrikes, or just as those airstrikes started last week, if you recall, also one of the first steps that Israel took was an incursion into the Golan Heights. And which of course, Syrians looked at it as just a land grab. I mean, there's no reason that the whole idea of the Golan Heights being quote unquote strategic. It used to be strategic back in the 60s and 70s, before drone technology and all that stuff. But it hasn't been strategic for Israel at all. I mean, Israel's, sort of military and high-tech might, funded by the U.S. I mean, Syria can't even, no one would even think about being able to match Israel's military might. So the whole idea of that the Golan Heights is strategic to begin with is completely flawed. And the further incursion into the Golan Heights is just, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as many people are concerned in Syria and the international community, is just a land grab. And it's unfortunate. Yeah.
And what are they trying? So they're trying to destroy all these weapons factories so that maybe they wouldn't be taken control of by rebel forces and then used against Israel. Like, what's the ultimate kind of goal, do you think, that they're doing with these?
I mean, yeah, that's certainly the rationale from their perspective, is so that they don't fall into any hands. To be honest, I don't hear a lot of Syrians, shedding any tears over these weapons necessarily. These are weapons that had been trained on Syrian civilians and no one else, not on Israel. Not at any point, actually. And of course, so also no one in Syria would want any of these weapons to fall into hands of, some rogue group or whatever. But honestly, I don't know what's left. I mean, how could all those airstrikes by Israel with that, with the heavy artillery, heavy airstrikes, how could anything still be left standing? It's a mystery to me, and it's a mystery to all the Syrians I talk to.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's really wreaking havoc on the environment. I mean, it's just devastating, the environment and the soil and everything. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the Constitution. Actually, let's go here for a second. What in God's name is going on with Tulsi Gabbard and Assad? And for people who are listening, Tulsi Gabbard has been nominated to head our intelligence apparatus in the United States, and there have been very lots of eyebrows raised about her meetings with Assad, and I believe it was also Putin, I think. I remember.
Yeah.
What do you know anything about this? And should we be concerned if the head of intelligence was meeting with Assad? What the heck is going on there?
I mean, yeah, I'm concerned. Definitely, I think there's cause for concern. Look, for some reason that there were, the far left and sometimes the far right were enamored with Assad. Why? I don't know. They just were. And she's just one of them. She was enamored by him. She bought everything he said. She signed up to all his narrative and all his talking points. And I don't know if she still feels the same way today. She hasn't. She's been reluctant to.
Pretty troubling. I mean, when there's so much evidence of this man mass murdering his people, and it's so obvious. I mean, I think what's so obvious about Syria is that it was so targeted against civilians, Like it wasn't, and it wasn't even like, they didn't even pretend. I mean, when we watched that footage, you didn't see the video, but one of the things that we looked at in that docuseries was the Russians that were bombing with these cluster bombs, and they just were dropping them indiscriminately. I mean, they were smoking cigarettes, drinking vodka, and I mean, it's so cliched, but it's true, like in their helicopters, and just being like, hey, check out this barrel bomb about to drop, with no sort of strategic anything. It was just dropped on a civilian population. I mean, I think that was something that got me really invested in helping Syria, was that it was so clearly against civilians, like versus, I don't know, a conflict where you could say, okay, they're really targeting armed groups, but civilians are in the background. It was like Syria was like, no, we're literally targeting civilians. Like there's no questions, there's no qualms. So I'm just so surprised that, like, how could you legitimately adopt this man's talking points? It's bizarre to me. Like there has to be some, I just keep thinking there has to be some interest there that we're not seeing of, that's beyond that. Like, why would she adopt his talking points? It's just strange.
It is strange, and I suspect because his talking points they kind of score high points with certain ideologues on the far left and on the far right. They score with the far left because the far left thinks, or buys into Assad and the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah regimes all being sort of axis of resistance against imperialism and all that stuff. Of course, that's complete BS. Their axis of resistance against their own people. So that's on the far left, and then on the far right, it feeds into Islamophobia. That basically, if Assad goes, then the Islamists will come, and only Assad protects minorities, and all that narrative, which is complete BS. I mean, Assad didn't protect minorities, and he wasn't secular; he was sectarian. Well, he's secular. He and his wife happen to be secular. That's neither here nor there. But his regime was sectarian, very much so. So I suspect. I suspect Tulsi Gabbard, kind of falls into, maybe it's her Islamophobia. Maybe I really don't know. I don't know. But one can hope that people change.
She said, I'm just looking at some of the quotes, that the U.S. and the CIA should stop their unproductive war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad. And should stay focused on fighting against who our enemy is. I mean, it's like really disturbing stuff.
Yeah.
So, Trump's cabinet picks really are just so bad. It's just, I just saw today that there's going to be no women for the first time in 50 years heading any of the House committees from their picks. It's just a goddamn joke. Anyway, I know so a couple more questions. What was women's role in the liberation of Syria? Do you know anything about kind of women's movements during Syria, the war?
Yeah, I mean, what women's movements, for a women's movement, quote unquote, to thrive, there has to be space for civil society, because that's just part of civil society, right? But women were always there. They were behind the scenes. They didn't seek being on camera. It was very unsafe to kind of reveal their identity. It would jeopardize their families. But they were always there. I mean, when I went into rebel-controlled areas, women were nurses. They were medical. They helped smuggle food. They smuggled documents back and forth. They worked in every capacity. They held underground schools. When basically the civilian area was being bombarded, they would take all the children to the basement and hold school session. They were always there. Very diligent, but very careful. Not to be identified, very much on the down low. And also women have been they've been part of those behind the scenes conversations with civil society, just between the exiles and
like the diaspora
regime
and
control. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they've already been playing a role all along. Yeah. So I'm hoping they will continue. And I mean, I'm sure they will continue unless there's some, external factors that try to push us out.
Yeah, and then as they think about the new constitution, I keep thinking about a couple things. I keep thinking about in Chile, how they elected like 760 people to draft the new constitution, and it's being headed by an indigenous woman. Is that the cat that was in Syria with you? Is this one of this is one of the warriors?
This is Pumpkin, and he's one of the war cats.
Pumpkin, hello. What a brave soul, Pumpkin.
He's 15 and a half, absolutely.
And you wrote a piece about the cats, right? I don't.
Yes, I did. My wartime cats, absolutely.
I have to go back and read that again. Anyway, as they draft the new constitution, I keep thinking about Chile's constitution. I keep thinking about, you wrote this fascinating piece about Sarajevo and looking at Sarajevo and Syria as kind of the similarities, especially because Sarajevo is, 25 years out of war, no, 30 years out of war, but still is kind of a disaster. So the Dayton Accords and also the Iraqi constitution. So when you think about drafting a new constitution, what comes up for you as like important things to keep in mind?
So, I mean, I'm working now on an essay actually about the drafting of the new constitution, and I'm learning a lot about the process. And the most important thing about the process is to remember that drafting the constitution is not the beginning. That's actually toward the end of the process, because you have to start with this process of getting everybody, all the stakeholders, to get into a conversation about what it means to be Syrian. You look at the constitutions of different countries around the world, and they open with by articulating who they conceive themselves to be as a nation state. So
like the identity of the people. Nation state?
Exactly, we the people, and then and they hold they hold high the principles that mean the most to them. So, for us, the pursuit of happiness, liberty, all that. For France, it's equality, fraternity, liberty. The Iraqi constitution, which was redrafted in 2005, starts with "we, the people of Mesopotamia." That's how they conceive of themselves, right? So, so with Syria, who is Syria? And you opened this episode actually by going through, the thousands, tens of thousands of history, and it is indeed that it has the world's two continuously inhabited cities, and that's Damascus and Aleppo. They're always competing for that title.
Right.
But basically it's this ancient society. Back in the day, it was Ottoman, it was Roman, it was Hellenistic. It traded with the pharaohs. It was city states. It was later it was Greater Syria, before the Sykes-Picot. So, and then it was colonized for 40 years. So it's just has all this history. It's diverse, always has been, and always will be. So, who is Syria? How will the Constitution open? We the people. And what? Yeah. So it's a beautiful, delicate, amazing process that's coming up. So, so we're definitely, all eyes on that.
Beautiful, delicate, amazing process. Okay, one last question, and then I will let you go, which is the role of Iran in Syria, because you wrote a really interesting piece on that. And how did the Iranian, and is Iran now going to be divorced from Syrian interests now that?
Yeah, it's interesting because so the Islamic Republic and I want to, differentiate Islamic Republic and Iran because, it's the Islamic Republic regime. And a lot of the Iranian people don't identify with the regime. So they're kind of under their own occupation, so to speak. So the Islamic Republic regime was in bed with the Assad regime, and the proxy group, Lebanon's Hezbollah. So, and that was sort of the bridge, the land bridge of the Islamic Republic, all the way from Iran through Syria to southern Lebanon along the Israeli border with Hezbollah. It's been an interesting partnership between the Islamic Republic and the Assad regime, even from before the war, before 2011. They were very cozy. They thought their interests aligned, and they thought, or at least a lot of Western analysts thought, that culturally they were similar, but they never were. The Assad regime belongs to the Alawite sect, which in theory is an offshoot of Shia Islam, and Shia Islam is what the Islamic regime adheres to. But they have nothing in common. It's like saying, the Gnostics of Christianity and the evangelical Christians, like the two
Totally
have nothing.
different.
They're not going to be, besties. So there was always this sort of clash between them, this cultural clash. They had contempt for each other, but it was a partnership of convenience. And now it's done. And actually, until we got to this point, I think they each had gotten very, very sick of each other. In so many ways, because the Assad regime couldn't really deliver anymore. His men were tired and hungry and not willing to fight. The Islamic regime could only shoulder so much of the burden.
Right.
They still had common interests, so they kept it up, but it was always a doomed relationship. It was just not going to go anywhere.
It's pretty historic. I mean, in the making, if this is like the departure of like this decades long allyship between these two nations, that's a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. And even the bigger deal is, how is this going to affect the Islamic Republic? And that remains to be seen. But I think the fall of Assad is devastating to the regional encroachment of the Islamic Republic. It's absolutely devastating. Yes, I think it's one of their biggest losses, this land bridge from Iran through Iraq and Syria and all the way to Lebanon. That's gone, and they are already trying to build bridges with Jolani, both the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah. They say they're willing to talk. They want to be friendly, but good luck. They have so much blood on their hands, so much Syrian blood.
Yeah, the Syrians aren't going to want them involved because they don't trust them. All right. Well, on that note, I just want to thank you so much, Rasha, for your courage, for your insight, for your continued expertise as this process unfolds. I know you're going to continue to be an important voice as Syria rebuilds and reconstructs and engages in these dialogues and visions and constitutions, etc. So thank you for your leadership in that and for taking so much time to come and really explore this with us on tonight's episode of Samanthropolitics. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Samantha. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful having you. So to everyone, thank you so much for watching or listening to this week's episode of Samanthropolitics. If you did find this show valuable, please consider supporting us on Patreon. If you'd like to see more of these episodes, you can go to patreon.com/Samanthropolitics1. That's SAMANTHROPOLITICS1 to support us for as little as $3 a month. That is literally less than a Dunkin' Donuts coffee, that you can support and show us that you want more episodes of Samantha Politics, and we will produce more of them. But we need to know that you are listening and that you want to see more of this coverage, and provide us with the resources to be able to do that. I also want to give a big thank you to stream inspectors, the leaders in live stream production, for being such wonderful, amazing producers of this show and creating all those cool backdrops that you saw, the cool global images behind me, et cetera, et cetera. And to Walker Advertising and Empower Global, our sponsors, thank you as well. In addition, if you are interested in being a sponsor of this show, you can feel free to just give me a DM on LinkedIn, pretty easy to find, and we can talk about sponsorship options for the show so that you can get your message out to a wider audience and show that you care about global affairs and about elevating women's voices in the foreign policy space. That's it for tonight. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.